give everybody updates as of the recording of this right now. This will drop tomorrow, so these numbers will be a little out of date, but I want to give everybody a sense of where we're at the moment. So at least 9,061 people have been killed by Israeli airstrikes on Gaza since October 7th, including 3,760 children. Israeli forces say that dozens of Hamas fighters were killed in overnight operations. That's quite in line with what we learned early on, that even after the first week of airstrikes, the confirmed number of Hamas fighters who were dead was 13, with about 6,000 civilians at the time. Joe Biden has now said there should be a, quote, pause in the fighting in Gaza to enable the release of hostages. This is interesting. The lower parliament of Bahrain has announced Bahrain is severing all economic ties with Israel. This is on top of a bunch of South American countries, which announced that a couple days ago, like Colombia, for example, and some others.
Bahrain, by the way, I think the first signatory of the Abraham Accord. So
that's very interesting and noteworthy. An Israeli airstrike hit a residential building in the Burej refugee camp in Gaza, killing at least 15 people, according to Gaza's Civil Defense Rescue Organization. At least 195 Palestinians were killed in 2 rounds of Israeli airstrikes on Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp on Tuesday. And actually, my understanding is they bombed it a third time as well. So there was the first bombing, and then we learned of the second bombing. Now I read 3. The UN Human Rights Office said Israel's airstrike on Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp on Tuesday amounts to war crimes. The scale of tragedy in Gaza is, quote, unprecedented, the Commissioner General for the main UN agency in Palestine has said. 400 people holding foreign passports are expected to be released through the Rafah border crossing. More than 20,000 wounded people, this one really got me, more than 20,000 wounded people are still trapped in Gaza City under the rubble, according to Doctors Without Borders.
Wow.
Then they go on here to say, this is The Guardian, by the way, 18 Israeli U.S. soldiers, this funny Freudian slip, 18 Israeli soldiers have been killed amid fierce fighting in Gaza. Thai officials held direct talks with Hamas, and Hamas assures them that the Thai hostages will be released in due time. And then get this, guys, the only cancer treatment hospital in Gaza is now out of service because it ran out of fuel. So I know that's a lot to digest. I just threw a lot at you, but Omar, why don't you take it over from here and tell us where you think this conflict is at and where it's going to go from here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, the word may be jarring to some people listening, but really there's no other way to describe it. What Israel is engaged in right now in Gaza is a massive campaign of terrorism. That really is the only way to describe it. They're engaging in mass indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas. They have killed, as you've mentioned, thousands upon thousands of children, obliterating entire families. Just multiple generations of the same family are being lost left and right. And we have a situation in which U.S. policy is to cover for this massive campaign of terrorism in the name of fighting terrorism, ironically. And what is even more distasteful than the way Washington is dealing with this, we all expect politicians to not particularly have moral considerations as the highest thing on their plate. But we think of media as the arm that's supposed to hold the power accountable. And unfortunately, the way mainstream U.S. coverage of this issue is effectively providing cover for these atrocities. They have decided that the Israeli government is the protagonist, Hamas is the bad guys, and if they're ever going to mention Palestinian civilians, it's always in the, oops, they're caught in the middle, rather than talking about Israeli war crimes in the way that they should be talked about. This is a government, before this crisis, not just here, is an apartheid government committing the crime against humanity of apartheid, according to every major human rights organization in the world, including Israeli organizations. That's the starting point. Engaged in an illegal occupation over Palestinians. And they, fundamentally, their policy is why we are here in the first place. Their policy sustains a dynamic in which violence is inevitable. So whether you're looking at who started this, there's no question that Israel started this by definition as an occupying power. And who's doing worse? Nobody is committing atrocities on the scale that the Israeli government is committing. And yet, what we have right now is a campaign of manufacturing consent for support for Israeli atrocities. And it's absolutely unspeakable.
Chris, I want to bring you in a second, but just to buttress your point real quick, the numbers with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they, in a year and a half of hostilities, they haven't killed as many children as Israel has killed in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So
not even, by the way, it was 480-something children for the entirety of the first year of Russia's bombing of Ukraine, which everybody understands was indiscriminate and included so many war crimes. The rate at which Israel is killing Palestinian children today in Gaza is more than 100 times more. That's the rate at which they're killing Palestinian children, at over 1,000 per week. It's just, it's insane. It is borderline genocidal violence is what we're witnessing. And again, you wouldn't know this watching mainstream American media coverage. We talk about it as if it's incredibly casual and it's just, it's what happens in war and we're moving on. But U.S. support is the reason why Israel is able to maintain and sustain that level of atrocities, and nobody's challenging it adequately, besides independent programs like yours, which I'm seriously grateful for, and the voice and the platform that you provide.
Well,
That's very kind.
I appreciate that. And I mean, I do think there really is no way to put a silver lining on any of this, but the fact that you see younger generations which don't consume the TV manufacturing consent propaganda, and they have a very different view of this conflict, is at least something to be hopeful for the future about. I wanted to go through some of those prominent, talking points that you hear from the defenders of these atrocities, and get you to, give your response. So first we have Ben Shapiro, who says, if you say that you don't understand the moral difference between 1, Hamas murdering babies, raping women and killing them, beheading men and kidnapping hundreds, and 2, Israel telling civilians to leave, killing Hamas members and hitting civilians because Hamas keeps them there, I don't believe you. You understand the difference. You're lying.
Yep.
Your response.
Honestly, Ben Shapiro is probably one of the most intellectually vapid people, and still has the speaking style to give you the impression that he's making really good points, and none of it would stand to scrutiny. And if you can ever get him on the show, I doubt you could. I'd be more than happy to be here and respond to all of those and debate every point of this. Look, ultimately, Ben Shapiro's position right now, in the name of being upset with a terrorist organization that is holding hostages, what he's saying on top of everything that you've just said is that what's happening in Gaza is going to continue until Hamas complies with Israel's demands and surrenders and whatever. He's effectively describing a situation in which the Israeli government and military, which in my view, the biggest terrorist organization in all of Palestine and Israel, holding a captive population in Gaza hostage and murdering their children by the thousands every week until you comply with their demands. Again, there's no other way to describe it apart from utter and sheer hypocrisy, that he is supporting literal hostage-taking and terrorism against civilians at a scale that Hamas has not even come close to. And he's presenting this as a moral difference, that we should know the difference between this and what Hamas is doing. It's honestly beneath.
Just for me to take a stab at that one as well, the idea that he pretends like Israel is not targeting civilians on purpose is absolutely laughable. They announced early on in the conflict a total medieval-style siege on over 2 million people. That is collective punishment by definition. After that, any conversation about, oh yeah, we're looking out for the civilians, utter nonsense. We know you're not looking out for the civilians. You announced it. And there's top Israeli officials saying there is no distinction between Hamas and your average Gazan. So it's just not true when he acts like we care about civilians and they don't. You definitely do not care about civilians, and they're copying the playbook of Hamas.
Yeah, and just to that point, Kyle, when you look at the breadth of the statements from Israeli leaders talking about this, right? We're cutting off all water and food and electricity to the entire population because they are human animals. The Israeli president saying there is no such, that the entire society, Palestinian society, is responsible for the acts of Hamas. Multiple people saying we don't care about accuracy. Our focus right now is on causing as much damage and destruction as possible. And yet you have U.S. officials jumping in to gaslight us by saying, no. Israel cares about the laws of war and international law, and they're trying to avoid.
We hope they'll follow the laws of war. It's like, you know that they're not.
They're not doing it.
Stop hoping. Do something about it. Yeah. So to that point, let me give you a few more. Since we moved beyond the point where they can really pretend like that they're not targeting civilians. I mean, the bombing campaign on the refugee camp was kind of a breaking point for that talking point. So,
even Wolf Blitzer was shocked.
Yeah.
Right. So let me give you some of the responses now of why this is still okay. Number 1 from the IDF, well, this is war. That's war. That's just
very convincing. Thank you.
The other line that you get is basically, similar to what Isaac Herzog was saying. Like, there are no innocent civilians. You had Alan Dershowitz, who said the citizens of Gaza are supporters of Hamas. You had Representative Brian Mast. He's the Republican who wore the IDF uniform, by the way, in the halls of Congress. He says, I think when we look at this as a whole, I would encourage the other side to not so lightly throw around the idea of innocent Palestinian civilians.
Jesus.
I don't think we would so lightly throw around the term innocent Nazi civilians. And this is very much in line, too, with the Netanyahu government's rhetoric about how this is our Pearl Harbor. these are Nazis. There was a leak to New York Times about how behind the scenes, U.S. officials were sort of horrified that they were just totally casually like, yeah, the way you guys bombed Hiroshima, that's like what we see this as being in line with. So what's your response to those arguments about why this bombing campaign is okay?
Yeah, so many. I mean, with that one comparison from the congressman in Florida, literally for him, the word Palestinian and the word Nazi are equivalent. That is what he's suggesting. I mean,
Yeah, that's correct.
It is utterly dehumanizing of an entire people. And look, fundamentally, they don't believe what they're saying, because if these were quote-unquote terrorists that are hiding in a major Israeli city or
Correct.
a major American city,
Yep.
they would not be so callous about the idea that you should just go in and carpet bomb Tel Aviv or New York to try to find some people. They would understand that that would be an intolerable atrocity, and they would never do it. So it is incredibly, again, you would have to view Palestinians as less than, as not equal human beings in order to justify these kinds of atrocities and talk about them so casually. That is fundamentally the driving motivation, I think, in all of this. And also critically, the idea that Palestinians are responsible for the actions of Hamas or whatever else is identical to the logic of somebody like bin Laden, who says, if your government does something terrible in your name, then the entire civilian population is legitimate targets. And again, watching otherwise sane, sensible, respectable people is the impression we want to get, echoing the exact same logic that somebody like bin Laden would use to justify 9/11.
Or that Hamas would
utterly
use.
horrifying.
Hamas
to
just
justify
used that logic.
massacring Israeli
A poll
citizens.
just came out. 83% of Israeli citizens said we shouldn't care too much about Palestinian civilians. So by that logic, are any of them fair game? Right? Like, that's the argument, right? And of course, it's not on one side. It shouldn't be on the other side either.
Yeah, it works in one direction.
Let me give the liberal framing now. Now
Oh, God.
that, you know,
This is even more dishonest than the other ones.
right now that it's undeniable, like the mass numbers of kids being killed and women being killed, et cetera, they feel like, okay, we got to say something or we got to call for something. So instead of calling for what they actually should of a ceasefire, we have the president and Blinken and Bernie out there saying we need a humanitarian pause. What's your response to that?
It's honestly, in a way, it is more distasteful to me. If you're just open in your racism and disregard for Palestinian life, that's one thing. I can just appreciate that you're an adversary through and through. But people who feign concern for Palestinians, while at the same time calling for stop murdering their children for just a little bit, let's see if we can get them some water, and then please carry on murdering their children, is
And we'll give you the bombs
shocking.
too, by the
Yeah,
way.
exactly. Yeah, with our full, not just funding, but protection as well, with the U.S. positioning warships off the coast to try to warn regional players not to intervene. The U.S. posture is, if you try to stop this ongoing genocide, you're going to face the military wrath of the United States. That is the implication of the U.S. posture. And yeah, it's utterly shocking, and it's deplorable, really.
Let me just interject for 1
Yeah.
second, because I find this fact fascinating. Drake, Angelina Jolie, and 55% of Republican voters are to the left of Biden and Bernie on this issue.
Yeah.
Because they want
2/3 of the American public wants a ceasefire.
right
80% of Democrats want a ceasefire.
55% Republicans.
And you have the Biden administration calling those who would want a ceasefire, you know, they sort of kind of compared them to like the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. And they also said that those calls were, quote, repugnant.
Yeah.
So that's where we are. The last one I'll throw at you, this is like the Piers Morgan question that he loves to ask all the Palestinian supporters, which to his credit, he's had quite a number on. Well, what would you do? You know, you're dealing this is a terrorist organization. In their original charter, they say they want to wipe Israel off the map. What else could they do?
Yeah, look, the fundamental problem with that question is the arbitrary starting point.
Yep.
What would you do to a particular incident that happened October 7th as if things were normal on October 6th? On October 6th, from the beginning of the year until before this attack, Israel had killed hundreds of Palestinians, including dozens of children already. Somebody may look at this and go, what is Hamas supposed to do? How would you respond to that?
Right. Yeah.
Nobody would even ask that question. Nobody would entertain the idea that
Right.
would legitimize the Hamas response
That's a
to
good point.
literally decades of Israeli atrocities. But we take it as a given that Israel has no choice but to commit these massive atrocities as a response. The obvious response is you need to get to a point in which you resolve the underlying problem that creates a situation in which violence is inevitable. When the ANC in South Africa during apartheid was setting off bombs and in many cases killing civilians, the obvious answer when somebody says, what are we supposed to do? You end apartheid. You create a better and more just world, and then you do still bring people who are responsible for individual crimes to justice. You still hold them accountable, but you certainly don't engage in this massive indiscriminate bombing and kind of war crimes that Israel is engaged in. So honestly, if you want to deal with this immediately, the range of options going from the systemic of solving the fundamental problem of Israeli apartheid, understanding that Palestinians are equal human beings who deserve the same freedom and dignity and human rights that Israelis enjoy, is the obvious big picture answer. But on a more narrow point, if you want to argue for the return of Israeli hostages in Gaza, or you want to try to hold individuals responsible for the atrocities they committed, this is the absolute worst way to do it. Everything that Israel is doing is putting the lives of hostages at greater risk. They don't know where they are in Gaza, and so when they're just engaged in this kind of bombing campaign, you are risking killing the very hostages that you're claiming that you want to try to rescue.
And you're creating more terror.
Absolutely.
I mean, there is no way that this is in the long-term interest of Israeli security.
Honestly.
Like, you have a little kid whose parents just got blown to smithereens along with 18 other members of their family. Like,
guess what?
Kind of politics
next
do you
Hamas
think they're going to
commander.
have
That's right.
when they grow up?
And that's not speculative. That is
No, for
literally
sure.
how we got here. This is the trajectory of, during a time in which Israel had pretended effectively in the mid-90s to be genuinely interested in granting Palestinians a state and giving them independence and so on, turned out to all essentially be a joke. They kept entrenching the occupation more and more. But support for Palestinian violence against Israelis during that period had plummeted very, very significantly. People don't have that kind of support for violent action when there is hope for a better future. And Israeli policy robbed Palestinians of that hope, creates the kind of misery and despair and this craving for vengeance that actually produces this violence, and that is exactly the blueprint that we're on right now with current Israeli policy.
Yeah.
I also find it very bizarre that everybody seems to acknowledge and admit casually, including top Israeli officials, that, the Hamas leaders are in Qatar living a cushy life. But then nobody says, well, hold on now. Then why the hell are you bombing the crap out of Gaza?
Yeah.
Right? Why not pay off the Qatari officials and go arrest the Hamas officials and try them at the International Criminal Court or something? There's even with a hawkish response, it's like, okay, you pay off the Qatar officials, you go send special ops to take out the top Hamas officials, but you've killed now 9,000 Gazans who didn't do anything here. So I just find that disconnect really weird that they all admit, all right, guys, this is just a little teaser clip. If you want to see the whole interview, sign up on Substack, link below.